to you all. We haven't been doing live stream for a while because been visiting other monasteries and looking after senior monks who've come from overseas to visit us. But tonight we have the opportunity to do one more, so here we are. And it happens to be a Tuesday night, so we have some questions have come in that need answering. Of course, Luang Por Chah said the best way to answer your questions is practice, and the answers will come through your own experience. But sometimes we also need some prompting and stimulation from teachers. That can be good as well. So, the first question tonight is, Luang Por, is awareness the same as perceiving things? However, mind activity is all conditioned, so all of these mind activity is not possible to know the unconditioned. Well, sometimes the way we translate Pali terms can vary from person to person, teacher to teacher. But generally, awareness comes perhaps from sati and sampajanya. Sati means is usually translated as mindfulness, sometimes mindful awareness. In Thai they translate it as recollectedness. Sampajanya is translated as clear comprehension or clear awareness. Perception or perceiving is usually translated as sanya, sanya kanda. So the kanda of the way we perceive the things, the objects we gain through our senses, sights and sounds and taste and smell. So literally means the way we remember things and interpret what we are seeing or hearing and tasting and so on. But, depends who's speaking, who's using these terms. So if it's a psychologist or someone, they might have a slightly different way of using them. I often tend to use awareness for knowing, with mindfulness, being fully aware of whatever object is contacting the mind. But you could sometimes I use awareness simply as being awake, being alert, knowing things, not necessarily being mindful, but just being aware, being conscious as opposed to unconscious. But the important thing is to note that these 5 khandhas, body and mind, are under the influence of kilesa, mental defilements, which originate in avijja, ignorance, and that's sometimes translated as unawareness or not knowing the truth, not knowing the Four Noble Truths. So, say the perception khandha, sanya khandha, is therefore under the influence of mental defilements, as long as we're unenlightened beings. That's greed, anger and delusion take over the sanya khandha. So we perceive things from a place of ignorance, greed, anger and delusion. And that is part of our practice, is establishing mindfulness, clear comprehension and wisdom, panya, to break through greed, anger and delusion, so that we're no longer perceiving things in a defiled way. As long as there are mental defilements rooted in greed, anger, delusion, coming from ignorance, then we say the mind is, the mental activity, as you've described, is conditioned by ignorance. So if you read the teachings and the explanations of Paticca Samuppada, the teaching on dependent origination or dependent arising, the way suffering arises out of the conditioning process that the Buddha described, it begins with avijja paccaya sankhara. Avijja, unawareness or ignorance. Sankhara, mental proliferation or karma, you could say. We make wholesome karma, punyapi sankhara, unwholesome karma, apunyapi sankhara. This is the conditioning process that leads on to ultimately to suffering and birth and more suffering, birth, old age, sickness and death. And the Buddha explains how that takes place, how different things can condition different factors in this process of dependent origination, condition each other. So, for example, when we see or hear, sense contact, gives rise to vedana, feeling, pleasure, pleasant or unpleasant feeling, or neutral feeling. When there's ignorance in that mix, then the rising of feeling gives rise to craving. I want this, I don't want that, and so on. And this is the way the conditioned process is going on all the time, every moment of every day. And what changes that is the presence of awareness. So mindfulness, clear comprehension and wisdom being trained, being developed, in the midst of that process starts to change the way the mind reacts, the way the mind perceives, the way the mind relates to its experience. So can bring in mindfulness and wisdom to see that feeling is impermanent, for example. And what is impermanent is subject to degeneration, decline, it's painful, so it's dukkha. And what is impermanent and dukkha is not self. It's not a fixed entity existing by itself. Feeling is a conditioned thing, and this process that the Buddha laid out and described is showing you how it's a conditioned thing. So you see a sight that's agreeable, you get pleasure. You see a sight that's disagreeable, you get pain. But that pain or pleasure is a conditioned thing, part of the process. It arises, and then it passes away. And when we establish mindfulness, awareness and understanding, wisdom, the mind tires of following and grasping hold of things that are impermanent, suffering and not self. This is where the practice of vipassana frees the mind from the whole conditioning process. And vipassana, or insight, relies on awareness, trained awareness, trained mindfulness and trained investigation of the Dhamma and insight. And this is what ultimately frees the mind from ignorance, and the whole process of dependent arising starts to grind to a halt, and what's left is awareness without being caught into this conditioning process anymore. And so we get to the unconditioned, which is ultimately Nibbana. So one who's experiencing Nibbana, that process has come to a halt, is being kind of pulled back or reversed until the point where ignorance is removed from one's experience, from the mind, So if there's no ignorance, then there's no more of this conditioning process, say feeling giving rise to craving, clinging, becoming and birth. That's all gone. That's why the Buddha said when he became enlightened or experienced the unconditioned, he said, no more birth for me. So in Buddhism, that's the highest happiness. That's what we're aiming for. Ajahn Buddhadasa loved to talk about this subject, so he would say it all comes down to maintaining sati, sampajanya and panya at that moment of sense contact, so that the cycle of dependent arising doesn't continue. At that point you have sense contact, feeling arises, but then because of the presence of mindfulness and wisdom, it doesn't give rise to craving. Feeling just becomes feeling. Or we say feeling is merely feeling, or just feeling. Craving doesn't arise, so that's one less, one cycle less, or one spin less of dependent arising. So if you keep doing that, keep bringing up mindfulness and wisdom to see the impermanence and the lack of self in your experience, the cycle of dependent arising gradually slows down. And we say the number of future births decreases. And that's why when the Buddha talked about progress in insight and training the mind, he'd put numbers on it. So he'd say no more than seven births for one who's reached stream entry. And that means they've actually reduced the cycle of dependent arising down to the point where it can only give a maximum 7 more births, or for a once returner 1 more birth, or a non-returner no more birth in human form, just maybe in the Brahma realms, and then one who's reached Nibbana, no more birth at all, because the dependent origination or dependent arising cycle has been completely cut. It can't arise again. Next question. No matter whether it's good or bad, people receive their own karma. So is it correct that I don't need to care too much about other people's nasty speech and behavior? Well, on the highest level, like you say, everyone is the owner of their karma, good and bad. So if somebody else makes bad karma through their nasty speech or behavior, then yes, they will receive the fruits of that. But when you say you don't need to care too much, well, one thing to be aware of, obviously, is that we live together in the world as human beings. So if somebody else is acting or speaking in nasty ways, then that could influence your life as well. So it's in your own interest to cultivate compassion and the wish for that person to change their ways, maybe, especially if it's somebody close to you, because that might improve your life as well, the quality of your life. Yes, ultimately speaking, they receive the fruits of their own bad karma, just as we do, each individual does. But, if you live with someone, work with someone, then their behavior will affect you, perhaps. It will test you, it will influence you, it will bring you different sense impressions that you have to deal with as well. So it's in your own interest for that person to give up their nasty behavior if that's what they're doing. So you may practice compassion, kindness, compassion, see what you can do to improve them, help them out of their behavior in any way you can, and that might be helpful to you or to the other people around you. Say you live in a family, you have one member who's acting unskillfully. or if you're in a position to help that person improve or change their ways, well, that can improve the environment for everyone in that family or that workplace or in that group of people. And of course that's good karma. When you practice compassion, kindness, or use the Dhamma to help someone else, to teach them or guide them, that's good karma that you're making, and it's their good karma that they're receiving help from you. But like you say, sometimes it's beyond our ability, so in the end sometimes there's nothing we can do. And we have to accept that in certain situations. So especially people who are further away that we can't influence, in another country or another place. Maybe you hear about them or witness the fruits of their nasty or unskillful behavior, and there's nothing you can do. But you could still have the wish for them to change for the better, because that will improve the world a little bit. If you have even just that wish for them to change, improves your mind, because it's better than the mind of hatred or revenge. And that wish, sending that thought out to them, occasionally that can have a good impact. Who knows? That's why we practice compassion as a meditation. We practice what we call the Brahma Viharas, the sublime abidings or the divine dwelling places of the mind. Cultivate metta, karuna, mudita, upekkha, kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy and equanimity. So even as mental aspirations, they're having perhaps only a small impact, but they are having an impact on the world, our mental world and then the world around us. So don't give up completely, but we also have to be realistic and know who we can help, who we can't. Another question: when someone is generous in giving things to others, but merely because society requests that, following manners, customs, traditions. Meanwhile, she is very bitter and jealous towards almost everyone around her. Then what kind of vipaka karma might this person receive? Well, it's correct, isn't it? When you practice generosity, the external act is one thing, but the internal state of mind is another, and sometimes they're in sync and sometimes they're a little bit out of sync. So like you say, sometimes people practice generosity simply following others or following a custom, but their heart maybe is not yet fully in that action. So the intention to be generous or practice generosity is not strong yet, maybe. Still, some good karma is made, because generosity is generosity. If you give something to someone else or help others, that's still a good act, which brings some good result to you. But the strength of the intention will also have a big influence on the kind of resultant karma, this word vibhaka karma, that you receive. So strong intentions tends to lead to strong result, weak intention, weak result. So and then you've noted that people's intention changes from moment to moment. So somebody can practice generosity in one moment, and in the next moment they can have jealousy or envy, or these different mental defilements can slip into the thinking of somebody from moment to moment. Even when they're doing good, then it can be influence, the mental defilements can come in and influence their stream of thinking and consciousness from moment to moment. So a very common one there maybe is somebody has some intention to be generous, and they maybe come to a monastery and offer something. But as they're offering a donation to the Sangha, of monks or nuns. They see someone else at the same time, maybe it's an event where there's a number of people making donations, and they see someone else offering more, materially more, or something that's bigger or better. And instead of rejoicing and enjoying their own generosity and feeling good about their own generosity, they become overwhelmed by jealousy or rage because somebody else is, taking the limelight or seems to be doing better than them in one way or another. So it can be a sense of self, conceit, pride comes up, hurt pride, hurt self. Can be competitiveness, can be greed, wanting to be number one, and then someone else takes over that position, and so on. So this is why we also practice mindfulness and cultivate insight as we're practicing even generosity, to observe other mental defilements that might slip into our thinking in that experience, and we have to see the harm, the suffering that they create, and maybe work to restrain them, let them go mentally, and restrain our speech, our actions, so they don't display those defilements either. So you see it sometimes. One person is making an offering, and then someone else comes along and interrupts them, or offers at the same time something different and bigger and better, and you see the eyes change. It's one way we express our mental impressions, isn't it? Our mental state is through our eyes. So the eyes change from being full of joy to full of aversion, and the look in the eye changes. It's an expression of that, isn't it? So that's already karma, isn't it? If your mental state changes from one of maybe having faith, kindness, generosity, renunciation, letting go, suddenly it's filled with rage or envy, jealousy, that's immediate vibhaka karma. Immediate resultant karma is your facial features change. Maybe you feel tense, maybe you feel hot where you felt relaxed and cool before, now you feel hot, angry. And so we experience vibhaka karma on physical level, mental level, verbal level as well. It affects how we relate to other people, obviously. What happens next, what we say, what we do is affected. So it's something a practitioner is to be on the lookout for. We practice in a complete way. The Noble Eightfold Path is a complete practice. Generosity alone is not enough. We have to practice sila and mindfulness and investigation of the Dhamma to develop insight. If we're cultivating the full path, whatever act of generosity we're doing, we're also cultivating these other qualities together. And that way it becomes a basis for meditation. And if you're somebody who's also cultivating mindfulness and insight through meditation, then you'll notice when kilesas arise, say as you're practicing generosity, maybe you have some doubt arise, or some competitiveness and some aversion arises, or it could be tiredness leads to irritation. If you're a meditator and you practice generosity, you'll be observing these changes as you're performing acts of generosity, and you can practice letting go in that moment. Whereas unfortunately some people, they practice generosity but they never show interest in precepts, or they never develop mindfulness or insight. So they may be under a delusion and think, well, I practiced my generosity, that was good enough, but they may not be aware of more subtler defilements that slip into their behavior, and they do have jealousy or competitiveness or disappointment or whatever can come up, and they're not aware of it, and they're not practicing letting go of it. So our aim is to cultivate the whole Eightfold Path together, Sila, Samadhi, Panya, or Dana, Sila, Bhavana. And that, of course, will lead to better results in our practice, more purification of the mind, and a better resultant karma. So one person with mindfulness and insight can offer dana, and that can be a cause for them to maybe enter a state of samadhi, or even have a clear insight into the impermanent nature of physical, mental phenomena. So the result is obviously going to be better. But wherever kilesa comes into our thinking, well, that takes away some of the goodness of the skillful act we may be doing. It diminishes it. And that's why you have to be on guard. So could be sense of self that arises, could be a subtle pride. When I offer dana, subtle pride comes in, saying, I am a good person because I've offered dana today, I am a good person. But that's a subtle attachment, isn't it? Sense of self-identity with that. And if we're not careful, then that takes over the mind and can be a cause for further suffering. Maybe somebody else comes along and says, oh, you're not as good as you think, or you didn't offer that much, or they don't acknowledge your goodness in some way, and then you feel hurt or you feel suffering because your sense of self has conditioned that and you haven't noticed it. So as we do good things in our practice, we also have to be aware of the attachment to goodness. And that can be one of the kind of subtle sufferings of the Dhamma practitioner. Another question. I heard the phrase in a Dhamma talk, to reach the place without water from a place with water. What does this mean? Well, this is a very topical comment or reflection that's being said in many Dhamma talks in Australia at the moment and around the world, because there's been a lot of rain and flooding. So it's one of those things monks joke about. We say, I'm looking to reach the place without water because there's so much water here. So yesterday I was in Bodhipala Monastery, and the kuti I was staying in started to flood at the bottom because the water was coming out of the mountain. There's so much rain and it was seeping into the kuti, so the floor started getting wet. So I was saying this, to reach the place with water is without water is happiness. When you got floods, you want to get away from the flood, don't you? So floods, oka, is one of the words the Buddha used to describe defilements. So a place beyond defilement, namely nibbana, or the unconditioned, is a place without water. And also greed, sensuality is often compared with water. Your mind is flooded by greed or lust. So you're looking for the dry land away from greed and lust. So for example, the Buddha compared the new monk to a wet log, a wet sappy log that's been sitting in the river for a long time. In Thailand, when I was living there, people used to store hardwood logs in rivers, and then when the time came to use them to build, they would pull them out of the river because the water would actually preserve them. And then they would work on that wood. And the Buddha compared the mind of a young monk to a wet, soggy log. You pull it out of the river, meaning you've just come out of the lay life. Your mind won't yet settle down in samadhi. Your sila is not yet well established. Your mind is not yet well trained. So it takes a long time to settle down in meditation and attain states of peace and samadhi, because you're still full of sensuality, and you're still used to the world and thinking of the world and missing the world. So you're like a wet log that needs to dry out in the sun on dry land. So sensuality is compared to the wetness of the mind, the sogginess of the mind, the floods of the mind. And Nibbana is the dry place that you're looking for. Just as in the floods in Australia at the moment, when you're in a flood, you look for dry land to get away from the water. So it's a nice phrase that monks often bring up in Dhamma talks. Another question. When I see people suffering, I feel sad for them. which could how could one deal with these feelings more effectively? Should I develop more metta, kindness, or more upekkha, equanimity? Or both. And karuna is compassion, is the usual response, the quality you're developing in response to people, your own suffering or the other people's suffering. And it's natural, if we're, as human beings, we're sensitive beings, so you see or hear about somebody's suffering, they're in pain, they're miserable, they're suffering in one way or another. Because we have a lot of good qualities already stored up in our mental consciousness, they can often come out quite easily. So you see someone suffering and you feel for them, don't you? You feel sensitive, you feel some similar pain because maybe you've been through something like that yourself, or you can be aware that someone else is suffering and you feel for them. That's quite a normal human response. But when you're practicing the Brahmaviharas as qualities that you're developing in meditation or just in daily life, one's practicing with mindfulness, so mindfully aware. And that's why these four Brahmavihara qualities, they balance each other and support each other. So if you are exposed to suffering, people suffering, you don't want it to overwhelm you to the point where your mind becomes defiled and caught into aversion or disappointment or frustration, because of the suffering that you're witnessing or encountering. You want to be able to maintain mindfulness, cultivate compassion, but not let the suffering that you're exposed to overwhelm you and bring your mind to a defiled state, maybe make you depressed or unhappy in some way or sad. So the anchor in the Brahmaviharas is upekkha, equanimity. And of course it's the hardest quality to develop because we are easily shaken by our experience. So if you see someone suffering, you can really feel it, and then you can feel depressed if you're not careful, you don't have upekkha, equanimity. So it's a quality you may have to return to when you're practicing compassion, and you return to equanimity and bring it up consciously to stop your mind falling into sadness or depression or becoming overwhelmed by the pain that you've witnessed or you hear about or see. And that's why you cultivate all these four qualities continuously, regularly. Put effort into that, and it's very valuable living in the world because you're exposed to a range of experiences, aren't you? For yourself and the people you live with and meet every day. Sometimes they're doing well and you can practice mudita for them, happiness, sharing their happiness. Sometimes people are suffering, so you practice compassion, but not to let your mind get carried away and defiled by these experiences that you're witnessing or contacting. You cultivate upekkha, equanimity, and that's particularly develops through understanding karma, that we're all receiving the fruits of our karma. So if someone's suffering, then that's the pain that has originated from their own actions, and maybe there's nothing much that can be done other than give them some compassion and support through their pain, through their suffering, but you may not be able to take it away from them. So you have to practice equanimity based on an understanding of karma, that they're receiving the fruits of their karma, or it could be yourself. Our basic attitude is one of metta, goodwill. If you cultivate that, that's a good starting point, and the other three Brahmavihara qualities come out of the metta. They're all very closely related and support each other. Next question. I notice when I see a cockroach that immediately there is vipavadanha, aversion. I can't bear to coexist with it. I can't live with it in the same room, apartment. Therefore, even I might break my precept, I would still try to get out of the house. I wonder, in this case, what is the quality I should develop? Well, try not to break your precept. Be patient. That's a very good quality to have when you're with animals or people that you don't like or you're afraid of or you're revolted by. Patience, rather than following the instinct to harm them or squash them or get them out, destroy them. Try to cultivate patience as a conscious effort. So patience isn't going to make you like the thing that you don't like, but it's giving you the strength, the qualities you need to be with it. If you have to be with a cockroach, then rather than destroying it, you're willing to be with what you don't like and what is uncomfortable. And you're keeping your mind in a wholesome state. So if your mind is in a wholesome state, then it's easy to go to metta, goodwill, abhayadana we call it. You're giving safety and forgiving that creature for being so annoying or unwholesome, unpleasant or ugly. Being what they are, you're allowing them to be what they are. You're forgiving them and you give safety rather than trying to destroy them. Of course, if you gave in to your desire to destroy a cockroach, then that will create karma, which will come back to you. And as we all know, cockroaches are one of the toughest creatures in the world, and they say will even survive nuclear holocaust, so be careful. You kill a lot of cockroaches, maybe one day they'll be running the world and you'll be under them. They'll be trying to squash you. Or some other karmic response might come back your way. But if you see something, go back to your mind. You see a cockroach, okay, it's unpleasant, it's there, you don't like it, you may say it's dirty. But in that moment, try and establish mindfulness and come back to your own mind and say, what's going on here? What is this aversion? And it will be based on a memory perhaps, a perception that you've stored up, I don't like this, and you're seeing the features of a cockroach, aversion arises. That aversion is a mental defilement. It's taking away your own happiness, your own purity of mind in that moment. And the way to proceed in the practice at that moment is, once you've established mindfulness, is to let go or abandon the aversion. Then you're doing yourself some real good, rather than following the aversion to try and harm or chase the cockroach. Establish mindfulness and let go of your aversion, and in that way the cockroach is actually helping you. And you can say, thank you, cockroach, for helping me see this attachment I've got, the aversion I've got. Now I can let it go because it's seen, it's known, and my mind is going to improve from this, and I'll get a little bit closer to Nibbana because of you. So that cockroach is helping you to Nibbana. So thank you, all cockroaches. Sometimes we get them in the monastery and we just do our best. When I see a cockroach, I just get a cloth or a little cup or something, pick it up and take it out into the forest. There's different ways you can deal with a cockroach without killing it. You can remove it from a place like your apartment, if that's where you are, without killing it. So once you keep the precept, then it leads on to the more skillful kinds of solutions and different kinds of behavior in those situations. You say, I'm not going to kill it, so what can I do? I can catch it, let it go somewhere else. And you'll find that in every situation there's often a number of options to deal with whatever the thing is that is disliked. Last question tonight. I am still confused about the difference between sukha and piti. Can you please explain? Well, when the Buddha described the state of samadhi, which is firmness of mind, stillness of mind, there's 5 main factors. Vitakka, initial thought or initial application of mind to an object, wholesome object, such as the breath. Vichara means sustained attention on the object. You're keeping your mind on that object. The 3rd factor is piti, which is translated as joy, rapture, enthusiasm, interest. So it's the opposite of being bored or the opposite of aversion. And these factors, they all have their opposites. So vitakka, initial thought, initially putting your mind on the object, say, of the meditation, the breath. It's the opposite of doubt. Because if you have doubt, you're not going to be doing that, are you? You say, well, should I follow the breath or not? Should I do this or not? Can I do this? Well, then you're obviously not going to put your mind on an object. Sustained attention on the object, vichara, is the opposite of sleepiness. Because if you're asleep, you're not sustaining your attention on the object. But when you sustain your attention on an object, you're not asleep anymore because you're staying with that object. You're aware. Your mindfulness is more continuous. Piti, joy, rapture, is the opposite of aversion. So you don't get angry when piti arises. So it's joy. It's a release of a certain amount of negative physical and mental energy from you. So you're not bored. You're not averse. So whatever the meditation object you're using, the breath or any other, when piti arises, it counters the tendency to boredom and aversion. You don't get angry with people when you have piti. Piti can arise, just listening to a Dhamma talk or seeing somebody do a good action, being kind or something as well. But particularly in meditation, it's a factor of samadhi. But it has a certain agitating nature as well, not in a bad way, but it is agitating the mind. We say it's like the mind bubbling up, or welling up, bubbling up with piti, with enthusiasm. Sukha means happiness. It's translated as happiness or contentment. That has a more quelling, calming aspect to it. So it's a slightly deeper quality that follows on from piti, which is more agitating. And sukha counters the tendency towards restlessness, anxiety of mind, endless thinking, worrying. So the mind really starts to become more still, quiet, calm, and obviously it enjoys, because it's sukha, it's happiness, it's enjoying the meditation, enjoying the object that it's focused on, such as the breath. The last factor of samadhi, ekaggata, one-pointedness, is the complete stillness of the mind. It's unwavering. And that counters sensuality, the pull of the senses. So when one experiences one-pointedness, then often the feeling of the body and then the senses drop away. One's no longer pulled by sights, sound, taste, smells, and even images and imagination. So the mind becomes really still, one-pointed. So if all those 5 factors are there, then that's samadhi. So piti and sukha, they're very closely related. 2 factors of the same thing. The one mind experiencing samadhi has all those 5 factors, but they perform different functions. Piti is the enjoyment, wholesome energy of the mind, the interest, and counters boredom and anger. Sukha is calmness that precedes the stillness of one-pointedness. It's where body and mind become very firm and they sort of merge together on the object. So that might be the breath, for instance. And They also say fullness of mind. In Thai they use the same word for when you eat and you feel full after food. Sukha brings a fullness of mind, so you don't want anything else. So that's why it precedes one-pointedness, where your mind becomes unwavering on its object. It doesn't need anything else to be happy. So it's this inner happiness. Another way they describe it, niramisa sukha, is not dependent on any material thing. Most of our sensual happiness is coming through the senses. You need to see something to feel good, hear something to feel good. We say the pleasures of the senses. Sukha, coming internally from the mind absorbing into a meditation object, is obviously independent of the senses and the material kinds of pleasure that we normally seek. So that's why the mind becomes very content inwardly, happy, doesn't need anything else. So all these 5 factors of samadhi are very important to develop, and if we develop regularly, we get more skilled at doing that. And for the skilled meditator who's attained one-pointedness, then they start to abandon, even one day might abandon piti and sukha as the mind is trained in developing just pure equanimity of the deepest states of jhana. So even the development of samadhi, one reaches a point where sukha is seen as something coarse. But in the beginning it's seen as something refined. It just depends where your mind is at and how well developed in the practice it is. So those are tonight's questions. I'll leave it there and wish you all well in your practice.